Okay.
And we are live.
Great. Jason, how are you? It's been too long. What's new?
Uh, yes, I guess some stuff has happened.
A lot has happened. Wow. I mean, the world is constantly in motion. Guys like you and I, who are familiar with what they call dialectical materialism, know that the world is constantly in motion and constantly changing. Um, wow. So Boris Johnson is now the UK Prime Minister, right? We got Boris Johnson. Now, you look at Boris Johnson and you look at President Trump in the United States. Do you remember how they told us that capitalism is great and all the rich people are rich because they're so smart? They're just so smart. That's why they're rich, right? Now look at
On
Boris Johnson and look at Trump.
one, a guy born into all of his wealth, another guy in a similarly thing, and they both have difficulty combing their hair.
Indeed, and they both are known for not being so brilliantly profound in some of the things that they say. But there you go, there you go. Right, one of the many myths of capitalism that has been debunked by the world we live in. But wow, I mean, so much going on these days. It's great to be here. It's great to have me on. We're having a huge chat, right? How's the audience doing? A good
They,
number of
that's it's slowly growing.
cool, cool. Yeah, is it hot up there in Canada these
Oh
days?
my God, yes. This is honestly the hottest that I've honestly ever been in. Like, there's
Wow.
really, I'm right in the wine growing region, and situated
Hmm.
between two lakes, so there's a lot of humidity.
Wow.
Was it the other day with the humidity? It was 42 degrees. That's like close to 117 degrees Fahrenheit.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, you broke up there. What did you say?
Well, the other day here it was 42 degrees with the humidity, and that's about 117 degrees Fahrenheit. You hearing me?
I'm having a little difficulty. I'm switching. Is it any better now?
I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you just fine.
Okay. Yeah, I just switched something on my phone. Maybe we'll come through better. But no, I think it's ironic that every time that there is a big snowstorm, every time there's a big snowstorm, I get informed by a number of people on both social media and in real life that therefore there cannot be any problem with global climate change. There cannot be any problem with global warming because clearly it just snowed, right? But you'll notice when we have exceptionally hot summers like this. I mean, we just had heat emergencies here in New York City. They declared a heat emergency. I mean, we're talking Fahrenheit over here, over 109 degrees Fahrenheit one day, and they never say, "Oh, look, that proves climate change. That proves global warming." I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. But if it snows a whole lot, that therefore disproves global warming. I mean, it's like the level of hypocrisy is pretty extreme there, don't you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, basically most climate denial is just confirmation bias anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it snowed, so therefore, I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. I am sold on global warming. I think it's just scientific fact, okay?
Yeah.
But one thing I'm not sold on is that I think that a lot of the forces promoting climate change, a lot of the big foundations and institutes, they think that the only solution to climate change is the world staying poor. And that I don't agree with. And they have very Malthusian solutions where they say there's just too many people in the world. They're having too many children. Countries in the developing world are industrializing too fast. We can't have that. And they have this mindset that basically, okay, well, it's bad for the environment for people to rise up out of poverty. And so people should just stay poor. And that I absolutely don't agree with. In fact, I would say it's the opposite. I would say the solution to climate change is we need more alternative energy. We need fusion energy. right? We need new fuel sources. We need alternative energy to stop just meaning solar panels and windmills, right? We need some real alternative energy to get us out of the trap of fossil fuels. I mean, the oil markets are cornered by Wall Street and London. If you look at it, big oil, the big four super major oil companies in the USA: Chevron, BP, um, Royal Dutch Shell, and Exxon Mobil. Exxon Mobil is the biggest of them, right? That's the inheritor of Standard Oil, Rockefeller family, right? Them plus Total in France, the French oil company Total. If you put all five of those big companies together, that's 88% of the global oil market. 88%. So those five monopolies control 88% of the global oil production apparatus. That's why we're not getting out of fossil fuels, right? It's because the global economy that runs on oil at this point, not just for fuel, but also for plastic, also for practically everything. I mean, there's oil everywhere you go. Is That's how the Western capitalists are able to keep control of the market. Is with this oil-based economy, and the only way out of it, we have to get out of it. If humanity can get out of the trap of fossil fuels, which is bad for the environment, bad. It's causing global warming. It's bad for humanity. If we can get out of that, that would mean reshuffling the global order. I think that would mean the end of the hegemony of the West, and that's why we're not seriously getting out of it. And that's why the voices in the West that are saying, there's a problem with climate change, just say, all right, well, the answer is to end development. The answer is to end human progress. There's no thinking beyond it. I mean, that human beings might be able to develop bigger, better fuel sources. I mean, I'm thinking about helium-3. Helium-3, that's an element. There's not very much of it on Earth, but on the far side of the moon, where China just landed their spacecraft, there's plenty of helium-3. And if we could get into fusion, I mean, the potential of the helium-3 on the far side of the moon to generate energy is astronomical. It's big. I'm excited about a lot of stuff happening, around the world in terms of alternative energy, space travel, and all of that. But yeah, I mean, but yet, there's some forces that just want to deny that there's any problem. So,
Now, taking on the oil industry is going to be one hell of a battle.
indeed, I mean, that's who runs the world. The big banks. You think of two big banks, right? So you got HSBC Bank in Britain. That's basically BP, British Petroleum. You've got Exxon Mobil in the United States, the big super major oil company, the biggest oil company in the world almost. And who is that? That's Chase Bank. I mean, this is the power of Western capitalism. It is oil. It is control of the oil markets. And that Saudi oil, the Saudis don't run their oil. Their oil is basically de facto the property of the West. United Arab Emirates, Nigeria, a lot of these oil-producing countries that are part of the Western capitalist system, it might be nominally nationalized or something to that effect, but it's still basically de facto the property of Wall Street and London. It's quite crazy. And then if you look around the world, all the countries that the USA seems to have a problem with, a lot of them are oil-producing countries that are competitors, like Russia, for example. Russia with their with their state-run oil company Rosneft, right? You've got Iran, you've got Venezuela. Before the overthrow of Gaddafi, Libya was an independent oil-producing country. Before the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, Iraq was an independent oil-producing country. Wall Street and London don't particularly care for people selling oil in competition with them. They don't like competitors. They want to keep the world poor so that they can stay rich, and that's the reality of imperialism. That's what Lenin was writing about in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism.
I thought it was very interesting. I was reading some Paul Cockshott. I'm going to assume you're familiar with him.
I've read some of his work. Yeah, somebody recommended it to me. I'm not as familiar with him as I should be, but go on.
He was demonstrating very much what we were just talking about there with regards to energy and alternative energy, and he was talking about a program that the Soviets were in the middle of designing before the Soviet Union came to an end. Essentially, you've heard of transferring electricity through microwaves, right?
Sure.
The Soviets were going to build a solar platform in orbit and use microwaves to catch the energy from the sun and send it down uh, down in order to be used by society.
Wow, I've
That
never heard of this.
that was something that was a design that they were working on, and that was going to be a thing. They also were going to use like large mirrors to reflect light into areas of Siberia where there was construction going on.
Wow. That would have fit in with the Virgin Land efforts, right? That they're trying to take parts of the Soviet Union that were not arable, where they couldn't grow crops, and make them into places they could begin growing crops and expanding agriculture. I know that was something they were trying in the 60s and 70s. Virgin Land campaigns were a big thing in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. So they had solar, they had solar ideas back in the 80s, like to not just solar panels, but a very very large scale collection of solar energy, and
Wow.
using microwaves to send it back down. And also, it's a shame that didn't, because you'd be able to get a lot of solar energy if you didn't have to deal with the Earth's atmosphere.
Sure, and I know that the Baathist countries in the Middle East at one point were talking about building a huge irrigation project for the Arab countries, and trying to irrigate and get water from somewhere else and irrigate the Arab countries, and then that would lay the basis for them to start producing their own food, and be less dependent on just the oil markets, and building a more inclusive economy. Because if you look at so many of the Middle Eastern countries, they've got oil and sand. I mean, they don't have very much infrastructure. They don't have very much other production. They don't have many factories. They don't have other things. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, these countries it's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that treaty that the Bolsheviks made public, where the imperialists were dividing up the Arab world, carving out, okay, this is going to be Saudi Arabia, this is going to be Yemen, and this was a secret treaty that after the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks made public. They revealed it. It was like, originally, it was like WikiLeaks 1917 or something, and that Sykes-Picot Agreement, that laid the basis for the modern Middle East. But a lot of the Middle East, they have oil, and they don't really have much else. They buy U.S.-made weapons. They sell oil and operate, extract oil for Western oil companies, and that's the entire economy. And the Baathist countries, the Baathist Arab socialist countries, were trying to break out of that. And actually, interestingly, Gaddafi, no one talks about this, but, you can Google the Great Man-Made River. And this was the largest irrigation project in the world, and it was Gaddafi's irrigation project, all through Libya, to bring water all through Libya, to try and make Libya into a country that would have more agricultural independence. They wouldn't have to import so much of their food, and to make Libya more than just an oil-producing state, right? To kind of build up more of a domestic economy. And it was a massive infrastructure project, this great man-made river, and a lot of it was destroyed during the 2011 war. Really a tragedy.
Yes, I do remember. I do somewhat remember the creation of the irrigation inside of Libya, and how they were calling Gaddafi a madman for having the plan and saying it wouldn't work. And then, oh, whoops, yeah, actually, it did work,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very successful.
Indeed, indeed. No, so there's this whole thing now with the oil tankers, where the British have seized an Iranian oil tanker, saying that it was sending oil to Syria, and that Iran has no right to send oil to Syria, right? Somehow it violates EU sanctions.
Which it doesn't.
And even Iran is not part of the European Union, and neither is Syria. So why does EU sanctions have any effect on them, right? If Iran wants to send oil to Syria, that's Iran and Syria's business.
Well, their excuse is that, well, it passed through an EU port and we enforce it, so it's a sticky situation where, yes, they do enforce it, but what right do they have to enforce their sanctions on other people?
Exactly. I mean, and it's pretty ridiculous. And Syria, facing an onslaught from these Wahhabi terrorists that want to turn the country into some kind of I mean, it would be reduced to a massive civil war if you look at it. There's so many different factions among the anti-Assad fighters. They're not all the same. Most of them are Wahhabi, extremists of some variety. And they're cutting people's heads off, and they're going into churches and cutting people and beheading people and killing everyone. And it's these violent extremist groups from all across the region trying to bring down the Syrian Arab Republic. Iran has sent its Revolutionary Guards to fight in Syria. I know Hezbollah has gone to Syria to fight on behalf of the Syrian government. And the Syrian government, and I mean, it's ISIS, for goodness sakes, emerged out of these terrorists backed by the West to bring down the Syrian government. That's where ISIS came from. You remember there was a clip of Obama saying that we're going to send the anti-Assad fighters Toyota trucks. We're going to send them Toyota trucks. And what was ISIS driving? What were ISIS driving? Toyota trucks. I mean, it was such a ridiculous thing. But then if you disagreed with it, well, then you're an Assad apologist. You're an Assad apologist. We're supposed to fantasize this is the glorious revolution. This is just, the glorious revolution. When actually a lot of the people that were protesting Assad during the Arab Spring are now supporting him. A lot of the progressive folks in Syria, like the trade unionists in Damascus and members of the Communist Party, were actually, they were protesting Assad in 2011 during the Arab Spring because they didn't like the corruption, the violation of human rights. But now they see that the issue now is the Ba'athist Arab Socialist government or Wahhabi terrorist extremists. And so it's kind of like, well, that's what we're down to. So, but if you say that, there's this crowd of people that want to fantasize that this is a one true revolution.
I always thought that was funny. You stand there, and can I please have some moderate democratic reforms? Can we have to change a few things in the country? And the next day you wake up and you're standing in a pit of Wahhabi head choppers.
Yeah, I mean, it's
like that's what you get when you take Western money. You're gonna lose control. I mean, I'm sure most of them didn't want Western money, but that's what happens when you start being allied with Western-backed forces. All of a sudden, what was simple democratic reform turned into Wahhabism, and now nobody's happy.
Yeah, I mean, the Arab Spring, it was like there was a powder keg. The economy had crashed. We had the global financial crash, 2008, 2009. And then there was a big drought all through the Middle East, right? Again, people not having water, very dry region, right? And, not having the irrigation and all of that. So there's a drought, so a lot of the people in the rural areas are desperate for water and pouring into the cities. And there was a powder keg brewing. And it appears to me that the United States, and in particular the Hillary Clinton State Department, said, okay, there's a powder keg brewing here. Let's kind of have a controlled release. And that's what they did. And if you look at it, right, social media was so big in the Arab Spring, and the fact that that there was somebody working with the State Department from Google Alphabet throughout the whole thing, and
really?
Oh yeah, and and you had Samantha Power, and she was in the State Department at that point. She eventually became Obama's UN ambassador. You had Anne Marie Slaughter, which if you read Anne Marie Slaughter's writings, I mean, she believes in using social media to foment unrest around the world. And essentially, there was an economic crisis, around the world and in the Middle East, and they said, okay, something's going to happen, but let's make sure this doesn't become a repeat of 1979. We don't want like a bunch of, anti-imperialist revolutions breaking out. So let's just kind of let the chaos break out. Let's use social media to control it, and let's make sure. And ultimately, the Arab Spring was used for the benefit of the West. I mean, right? You got Syria, longtime anti-imperialist, Ba'athist Arab socialist government, now facing civil war. You had the Libyan government toppled, and they were able to kind of channel things the way they wanted. I mean, in Egypt, right? It was, Mubarak. He was brought down, and then for a while they had a Muslim Brotherhood guy who was elected, and now the military is back in power. Yeah, I mean, it was manipulated, and I think that Obama as president, and I've talked about this before, was really key in those events. I've compared Obama to Napoleon because a lot of people don't know this, but back, when Napoleon was leading the French military in Syria and in Egypt, he put up posters everywhere telling everybody that he was a Muslim, and he wasn't. Napoleon was not a Muslim. But he put up posters out all over Egypt saying that he was a Muslim, he believed in the Prophet, he believed in the Quran, and that he would, he was going to restore the rights of Muslims and they should join with him against the British. And I think that, Obama, right? I mean, the fact that the president of the United States was a guy whose middle name was Hussein, a guy who had attended a Muslim school in Indonesia, you know, he never said he was a Muslim, but it was kind of a wink and a nod to the Arab world. Like, look, here's a guy who's on your side. This is a guy who understands you more. This isn't George W. Bush. Can you imagine what would have happened in the Arab Spring if that level of protest and rebellion had happened when, like, Bush was the president? Or, like, if Trump was the president? What would have been the result of the Arab Spring? It would have been massively different, right?
Oh
But
yeah.
the fact that there was a guy in the White House who the Arab world was kind of faked out to believe, kind of sympathized with them. That was key. That was key. I mean, it's all window dressing. It's all PR. That's what I think, at least.
No, no, I would definitely agree with that. That was it was. I
Yeah.
actually didn't know that they had done that. That they had tried to market Obama as a Muslim very underhandedly.
That's what it looks like to me. I mean, here in the USA, that was the right wing was constantly playing up the idea that he was a Muslim. Oh, he's going to swear in on a Quran. It was all this stupid, stupid right wing stuff. But at the same time, there was like, the fact that Obama had met with Edward Said, the Palestinian intellectual. That was played up in the media. The fact that he didn't like Netanyahu, Netanyahu didn't like him. In global media, I think that gave a lot of people in the Muslim and Arab world, it gave them a lot of belief that maybe Obama, was sympathetic to them and all of that. Um, I know some of the folks at the blackagendareport.com have talked about Obama not as a lesser of two evils, but as the more effective evil. That was the term that they used. And if you think about it, I mean, the Obama administration, in a lot of ways, was far more effective in terms of manipulating world events to serve Wall Street and London, right?
Definitely, Obama was very, very powerful in that regard. Oh, look, we got a black president now. Everything's going to be okay, people. Everything is going to be different. He's going to understand social justice issues because he's black, and he was very well mannered. He was well put together. He was well spoken. He was a statesman that really made you believe in him. I mean,
Sure.
even people that knew that the system was BS was believing him to some degree or another because of the way he had put himself together. It was very believable. He seemed very progressive. Like, he said the right thing at the right time. He didn't overreact to a lot of the right wing BS that was thrown at him. He played that off very, very well, and he's the kind of guy who's a born statesman. And he was really able to. There's few leaders that were ever able to make you think things were going to change. Kennedy was one. JFK was one of them.
Sure. Sure.
Obama's definitely one of them, and he did that very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, he very much, in some ways you could say he appealed to the best in people in a way. He appealed to people's better side in order to carry out his evil deeds. You know, one thing is that, there is this like Fox News right-wing narrative where you get the impression that Obama was a communist, his whole time he was a Marxist and a communist hanging out with Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn but his entire career, if you look at Chicago politics, that's simply not true. I mean, his first campaign was against Bobby Rush, and Bobby Rush was a former Black Panther, and he ran against Bobby Rush, and it was from the right. I mean, he portrayed Bobby Rush as being an extremist, as being too far left. Obama was always running from the right against local Chicago folks. He was always, he ran the Chicago urban machine of the Democratic Party. I mean, that's Mayor Daley. I mean, and it's been around for decades, and it's one of the Democratic Party's, not, its uglier sides. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Chicago now with all the killings that take place, the amount of murders that happen in Chicago, the amount of poverty that takes place there. I mean, that city is certainly not a showcase for far left policies. If anything, it's a showcase for corruption and all kinds of bad things. I mean, there was a police officer in Chicago for years, a guy named John Burge, and he would extract confessions from people with electrical shocks. Right? He would torture people into confessing. right? For years, this guy John Burge would do that, and it went on for a very long time. That this was happening in Chicago. That's the kind of corruption that was there, and that was the Democratic Party running Chicago like that. The Chicago Democratic Party machine is particularly ugly, and and that was what Obama, prior to even being an elected official, Obama was like, he was like a rank and file Democratic Party organizer with, Acorn and all of that. And he was a Democratic Party operative in Chicago, really. And, they make a thing about, the Weathermen, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, but they were never, after about the 80s, they stopped. They were not revolutionaries. They were not, they engaged in ultra-left, adventurous terrorist activities in the 70s, and after that, they're just kind of well-known typical Democrats. And actually, Bill Ayers, his family is very, very wealthy. They're one of the wealthiest families in Chicago, and they were just 1960s rich kids. They were part of SDS, and they went and did that ultra-left adventurous thing in the 70s, and then I guess they never went to prison, and then they're just kind of typical Democrats now. If you watch Bill Ayers' debates with Dinesh D'Souza, you'll see there's not much radicalism there. The message is just kind of be an activist. Racism is bad, sexism is bad, be optimistic. But he'll denounce up and down any socialist country. He'll denounce up and down any revolutionary movement. The idea that that the fact that Obama knew them or whatever is some big scandal that proves Obama was, a communist or something. It was pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, that was one of the things that used to drive me nuts, was the claim that Obama was a Muslim, and there was literally no evidence. And then to claim he was a communist, and I would have to keep. Oh God.
Well, the real scandal with Obama in Indonesia as a child, right? That's what they would base it on. They'd say, oh, he went to a radical Muslim school in Indonesia. Well, the real scandal is that his mother, Ann Dunham, was married to an Indonesian general who was committing genocide, right? That was at the time. You'll remember 1965, there was a coup in Indonesia. The elected leader, who was sympathetic to Mao, was kind of he was like a socialist, and he was aligned with the Communist Party, and he was friendly to China, right, was toppled by the Indonesian military. And then the CIA worked with the Indonesian military to start killing all the communists in Indonesia, all the leaders of the Communist Party. But then that escalated into it turned into a genocide against ethnically Chinese people in Indonesia in 1965. It was like 500,000 people killed. Right? And Obama's mother was married to one of the generals in the Indonesian military who was engaging in this genocidal activity, right? Where they were slaughtering whole neighborhoods of ethnically Chinese people, right? That is a scandal. The fact that Obama was a little kid going to some school where they had Islam or something, that's not the scandal there. The scandal there is the Indonesian coup of 1965, and the fact that Obama, lived in a household with somebody who was doing some of the horrendous atrocities.
Is that the Mau Mau, or is that Kenya?
Well, the Mau Mau were in Kenya.
Yeah,
that was
okay.
That was in the 1950s in Kenya. There was an uprising against the British. That was particularly, and it was dealt with by the British to the point of just kind of rounding up the people and putting them in camps, and it was big atrocities in the 1950s in Kenya. That's very famous. And it doesn't get talked about. It's again, that's the whole thing is, you get these numbers from people who don't like the Soviet Union, they don't like China. They'll be like, oh, the Soviet Union killed 100 gajillion gamillion people, and it's like every person who died ever in the entire existence of the Soviet Union, it's a crime of the system, right? There was mass death from malnutrition under the Tsar. All the time. Every year people died under malnutrition under the Tsar, but that wasn't because of capitalism or because of the Tsarist system. Right, but under socialism, the fact that even though they built the agricultural system that cured starvation, right, even though they brought tractors into the country for the first time, they mechanized agriculture and all of that. No. The fact that there was a famine, that proves that the double standards are ridiculous. And then you can go through the history of capitalism and look at how many famines and not just famines, but outright mass episodes of mass murder and killing have been carried out by the British Empire or by Western capitalism, and you can look at that and the numbers are massive. The Belgian right? The genocide in the Belgian Congo, for example, right? I mean, that's, where Belgium had this, this like, this autonomous, this state that was under the control of the king, where they were working people to death in order to extract natural rubber. I mean, millions of people killed, in order to extract natural rubber for the Belgian capitalists and bankers. Again, no one talks about it. The mass famines in India, where people in India were dying in mass, so that the British could maintain their monopoly and control the markets there. I mean, unbelievable. I mean, in Ireland too. I mean, you can go down the line. The episodes of mass intentional starvation and killing of people by Western capitalism. No one ever says, "Oh, well, this many million people were killed by capitalism." No one ever says that. It's beyond frustrating. But yet, every death that ever happened in the Soviet Union or in China proves that communism is evil. This is such a double standard.
Oh, it is. It is like really ridiculous. Like somebody could trip and fall and bang their head on a rock, and it was somehow Stalin's fault. And
Yeah,
yeah, but do you know how many people died in the famine in China? Like, you realize that famines occurred all the time in China. One happens under socialism, and then never again.
yeah. I mean, exactly, and it's because of socialism that China has gotten where it's gotten today. And it's because of socialism that the Soviet Union became a world industrial superpower, was producing more steel than any other country in the world. I mean, it's astronomical. Like Winston Churchill in particular, right? So you want to talk about, people are like, oh, how can you like Mao? How can you like Che Guevara? They're murderers. Look at Winston Churchill for 1 second, right? I mean, this is a man that when the Iraqis were rising up and fighting for their independence, supported the use of poison gas against the Iraqis, right? After poison gas had already been outlawed, right? The Geneva Convention, they'd outlawed the use of chemical weapons. The Iraqis are rising up and fighting for their freedom. And Winston Churchill supports the British using poison gas and chemical warfare against the Iraqis. And when they ask him, how can you support this when we've outlawed this? He says, yes, but the Geneva Convention, it outlaws the use of poison gas against men, not against uncivilized tribes. I mean, this is Winston Churchill, I mean, this is like Mr. Genocide, right? I mean, people are starving to death in India, and he says, oh, they have too many children, that's why. I mean, it's like, but again, Winston Churchill is every History Channel documentary about World War II. He's the great defender of freedom. He's such a great fellow. Oh, he called out the Iron Curtain. It's astronomically ridiculous, right? I mean, the Vietnam War was going on, right? And we can have Broadway musicals about how great Lyndon Johnson was here in New York City. And yet how many people died as a result of the Vietnam War that he escalated and presided over, right? I mean, how many millions of Vietnamese people is he responsible for the deaths of? Same with Richard Nixon, but again, no one ever says, oh, you can't like Lyndon Johnson, he's a mass murderer. Again, the double standard is massive.
Didn't Lyndon Johnson's wife own stock in like a helicopter manufacturing company?
I didn't know that, but it wouldn't surprise me. It really wouldn't surprise me. The crazy thing about Lyndon Johnson is that that he was very much an advocate of a welfare state. He was a big supporter of the war on poverty, and he was very much an advocate of kind of like social welfare programs and food stamps and things like that. What's also odd is that he was considered, like when Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson as his running mate in the election, that was very much a favor to the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party, because at that point, the Northern Democrats were supporting Martin Luther King, right? Kennedy was known as kind of a supporter of Martin Luther King. It wasn't consistent. He wasn't consistently supporting him, but he was known for supporting the civil rights movement. So by picking Lyndon Johnson, that was kind of a wink and a nod to the Southern Democrats that were anti-black and for segregation. And so much so that Lyndon Johnson, his nickname was actually, people used to call him Lynching Baines Johnson instead of Lyndon. Like that was how much of a racist he was. But yet, oddly, when he was president, he ended up signing civil rights legislation, and he ended up enacting a lot of social programs that really benefited the black community. And like, he was very famous for, there was some area that was struck by a hurricane or something, and he showed up with a bullhorn and said, "My fellow Americans, this is your president. I care about you." He was known for he kind of is remembered as kind of being a friend of African Americans and Latinos. But I mean, but his history prior to becoming president, he was just he was just really known for being a segregationist and for being particularly rotten. At one point, he was a high school teacher, and according to a couple of the biographies, one of his like trademarks as a high school teacher in Texas was he had a lot of students who were not English speakers in their household. They spoke Spanish in their household, Chicano students. And he instituted a policy where any student who spoke any word of Spanish at the high school would get paddled, get spanked, and that was, he implemented that policy to basically beat the language out of these kids. I mean, that was Lyndon Johnson, not a particularly nice fellow, and then ultimately was Vietnam. But yet he's remembered as just being, hey, he was a president. Oh, and there's a Broadway musical about him, and it's bizarre. It's bizarre the double standard these people have. These people, who am I talking about? It's the double standard of U.S. media, I should say.
Yeah, it's like when Germany was denouncing Saddam Hussein for using the poison gas on the Kurds, and then, oh look, it was a German company that was actually selling the gas to him, and oh look, we had him executed before we could start asking questions about where Saddam got the gas from.
Sure. I mean, it's astronomical, and I remember at the time of 9/11, that was particular. Like that moment for me, I was young, but 9/11, it was kind of like, it was like, the only reason anyone could not like the United States around the world was because they hate our freedom. And it was just kind of, there was a moment where I was kind of learning about the crimes of the United States around the world, and it just seemed like the media was never acknowledging any of that. And that was, that was the whole Noam Chomsky. I remember right after 9/11, like nobody opposed things, but Noam Chomsky did, and there was kind of a moment where right after 9/11, it seemed like some of these kind of new left pacifist voices kind of dominated the left, and their argument simply consisted of pointing out the crimes of the United States around the world. I think, though, that the narrative that like Ward Churchill put out after 9/11, or the narrative that Noam Chomsky put out, that basically arguing that, okay, well, the USA has gone around the world and committed all these crimes, and now someone's committing this crime against us. That narrative was incorrect, because the important thing to point out here is that Al-Qaeda was not, it wasn't like this wasn't Saddam Hussein that attacked the United States. It wasn't communists or revolutionaries who attacked the United States. The people who attacked the United States have been longtime U.S. allies. They were Saudis, right? I mean, Osama bin Laden worked with the United States in Afghanistan. That's how he got his start.
I don't know, man. I think it really was the feminists, the abortionists, the gays. It's Pat Robertson. I mean, Pat Robertson don't lie. He's a man of God.
Right, but but that narrative that kind of it was almost like the left was telling the American people they somehow deserved 9/11 or something, not pointing out that this wasn't forces around the world that were anti-imperialist taking revenge. That's not what happened. This was crazy jihadist extremists that we in the United States we have cultivated, and have been using to attack, anti-imperialists. That's who, according to the official story, is responsible for 9/11. So at no point, it was not anti-imperialists who attacked the United States on 9/11. I mean, by no account. It was a faction in the Middle East, the Wahhabi jihadist extremist faction. It was a faction in the Middle East that the United States had been using as an attack dog for so long. So of course people are going to hate the left if you go around, if you sound like, oh, well, we deserve 9/11. If you sound like that, of course people are not going to take you seriously, And the problem is that the leaders of the United States, instead of trying to keep the population safe and protect them from terrorism, are too concerned about overthrowing anti-imperialist governments, right? And if you look at it, that's why we were, as recently as Syria, it was the same situation all over again. Just like in Afghanistan, we had backed Al-Qaeda, linked, the forces that eventually became Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, to fight the Soviet Union. Now in Syria, just the same situation. We don't like Bashar Assad. He's a secular Ba'athist Arab socialist. So we're backing the Al-Qaeda people to overthrow him. I mean, the problem is that the leaders of the United States aren't committed to keeping the people of the United States safe. They're committed to extending the rule of Wall Street and London over the planet. And if that means unleashing more terrorists and extremists, they have no problem doing it. That's the issue. And that messaging, where it was kind of like the message that the average Americans were the problem, that this was revenge for that message, caused a lot of people to really dislike the left. I think it was a huge blunder to hear that coming from left-wing circles.
No, I don't believe that Al Qaeda was some kind of anti-imperialist force. That's obviously not true.
Yeah,
I
and it's
I,
embarrassing.
I, 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 I I think that the point that I was always trying to make was that this kind of thing was probably always coming. That because of everything that not just the United States, the UK, Japan, etc., has done to the world, you've got to expect that sooner or later somebody is going to do something back. I mean, even if you take the bully in school, who's always pushing people around, taking their money, taking their lunch money, whatever, sooner or later some kid gets so mad that he flips out and attacks the bully.
But what I'm saying is I don't think that's a correct analogy. I think it's almost like, say that the bully, terrorizes kids by having a wild dog that he brings to school with him. And then one day that wild dog breaks loose from its leash and turns around and bites him. That's basically what happened. It wasn't the victims of U.S. imperialism that attacked on 9/11. It was forces the U.S. had fomented to attack victims of U.S. imperialism. It was like it was at no point have the Al Qaeda Wahhabi extremists been anti-imperialists.
Oh
At
no,
no point.
I'm not
Yeah,
saying it's anti-imperialist.
yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, and I have this new book I just published, I've been promoting it. It's been doing very well. I was on Sirius XM to talk about it. It went very well with Dr. Wilmer Leon, a good friend of mine. It's my new book is City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. And one of the big themes in it is this understanding that the way imperialism works now is that Wall Street and London, they stay in power through creating destruction. That's basically our world economy is centered around forces that don't make profits from raising the standard of living, from building things. They make profits through tearing things down. They make profits through keeping the world poor so that they can stay rich. Accumulation through destruction. I refer to it, I talk about the Atlanticist pathology, right? And you can talk about, throughout human history, there have been different civilizations that have emerged. And you've had civilizations that have emerged where you can talk about Greece versus Rome, for example, right? Greece, the Greek city-states, Sparta, Athens, the way that they advanced and the way that the rulers of the Greek city-states advanced was by building things, by making advances and breakthroughs. They were overall about raising living standards and advancing human progress, despite all the flaws there, obviously. But if you look at Roman civilization had the opposite role. It was about controlling the trade routes. It was about, they said all roads lead to Rome, meaning that if you couldn't have a road connecting one part of the empire to another. It was about going around the world where things had already been constructed, and at the point of a spear with a big army, forcing them to pay tribute. Those are two different civilizational models. You have a civilization that's based on advancing human progress, advancing technology, building things up, like the city building tendency in human history. And then you have civilizations that are about plunder and controlling trade routes and keeping the world poor and extracting from those who have already built. So that's my new book, City Builders and Vandals. And I go through human history and I talk about the rise of the British Empire. I talk about, the international global capitalist system that we have now. I talk about the alternative, that's rising in the global economy with the Bolivarian countries, with Russia and China, with what Iran is doing in the Middle East. I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at things. But that's what I'm talking about in my new book. But yeah, I mean, when Lenin writes his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he's describing a real change. As bad as industrial capitalism was, the industrial capitalists, right? The Carnegies that were building those steel mills in the United States, they still saw what they were doing as advancing U.S. society, right? They still, they financed public works, they built libraries, they did things to the point where they thought that their own profits advanced as U.S. society overall advanced. right? And the real change was with the rise of imperialism. The big difference between imperialism and the prior stage of capitalism was instead of industrial capitalists being the dominant ones in the economy, it was bankers, it was finance that became dominant. And Lenin describes that in his book. I mean, the rise of international monopolies centered around banks. And how do bankers make money? They make money by having money, right? They lend money at interest, right? And bankers can make money without things advancing, right? As long as people are having to come to them, as long as they exist as the creditors, they can continue to make profits. And it's about controlling the trade routes. It's about carving out the world into spheres of influence, making countries into captive markets, holding back economic development. That's the nature of imperialism. It's really degenerating at this point into what you could call accumulation through destruction, where when people get poorer, when wars break out, when countries are cast into chaos, when lives are destroyed with drugs, all these ways that people getting hurt, people being destroyed, reap profits for billionaire monopolists. The ruling class at this point doesn't get its wealth by advancing or building anything. It accumulates through destruction. It's very scary. That's what capitalism is in, and it shows the need for us to get to socialism, for us to get to a society where the banks, factories, and industries are controlled by the people, and the economy is rationally planned to serve human needs and not profits. The necessity is there more than ever, I would say.
Well, it's always been there.
Sure, but more than ever. And this, the computer revolution is a big game changer. Because if you think about it, we're very close to driverless cars, right? It's not that far away with artificial intelligence, driverless cars. Think what that would mean. How many jobs are you going to destroy with driverless cars, right? We've already got, at this point, we've got, computers that are getting rid of some of the most, skilled jobs you've ever heard of. Like people that work at insurance firms and calculate risk. Computers can do it better, and computers are replacing workers everywhere you go. And so we're going to have millions of people that have no role in the global apparatus of production. It's a big, big change. The industrial worker is being relegated to the history books. Karl Marx wrote about human beings being reduced to appendages of machines. And that was the phenomenon of his time, right? Is that you have all these skilled craftsmen, basket weavers and wood carvers and all of that, and they were being, reduced to appendages in the industrial machine. Well, now we've got machines without appendages. That's the reality. And the only thing that human beings have left that's marketable is, their intelligence, their ability to have a soul, to be human, to think rationally, to create art, to be creative, right? It's only our humanity that distinguishes us from machines. I really like Jack Ma, the tech billionaire in China. He said, we used to make people like machines, but now we have machines that are like people. And I think that really explains what we're dealing with here. And the whole way we speak to people, the whole way we raise children in terms of education, all of that has to be restructured in this new age, because we're at the point where we don't need industrial workers. We don't need people to be appendages of machines any longer. And that points toward the reality of socialism more than ever, because under capitalism, right? I mean, what's the Communist Manifesto talk about? You only can work. You only can live so long as you work. You only can work so long as your labor expands capital. Right? That's the reality. The worker exists to make profits for a capitalist. And when there's no place for a worker in the means of production, you have a big problem.
Well, the automation is really going to start changing things. It's gonna put a lot of people out of work, and capitalism is gonna be it's gonna come to a head. Either it's going to have to institute some kind of social welfare system, or it's going to collapse.
Essentially, and more than a social welfare system, though, it points to the necessity of planned economy. Under socialism, technology advancing is a good thing. It means less work for everybody. That's really what that's the contradiction. Under capitalism, advances in technology lead to greater poverty, because people lose their jobs. Under socialism, when you have a planned economy, when the means of production, the banks, factories, and industries are controlled by the people, advances in technology are good, because there's less work for everyone to do. And that's the contradiction. That's what Marx wrote about in Capital when he talked about workers' competition with machines. And that's we're facing, the fact that the only way we can get out of this, we're going to have a long crisis of overproduction, right? Because in addition to people losing their jobs and not having jobs because of technology, under capitalism, the worker is also the consumer. And so if the worker has no income, how can they keep buying these products that are being so efficiently produced? That's the problem, right? So eventually, we're going to have a situation where the global means of production are so efficient and can churn out products like never before, but workers, because they have no place in that global apparatus of production, will not have the ability to purchase these products. And we're going to have a glut in the market of products that cannot be sold. This is the natural, built-in boom-bust cycle of capitalism. But when you have such a huge leap in the means of production, right, where the computer revolution is basically eliminating the jobs of workers, the result, the crisis, the bust that you're going to get, the depression that's going to come out of that is going to be beyond anything we've seen. It's going to be massive, right? I mean, the Great Depression of the 1930s was largely brought on by Henry Ford. Henry Ford developed this very efficient way of building cars, factory assembly line production, and the result of that was millions of workers being thrown out of the means of production. And pretty soon they weren't. You had the crisis of the 1930s that gave birth to the Second World War, right? Ultimately the Second World War came out of a prolonged crisis of capitalism because of Henry Ford's innovations and because of the advances in assembly line production. But assembly line production was nothing compared to the computer revolution that we're seeing right now with artificial intelligence.
No, that's not going to be a quantitative. That's going to be a qualitative change.
Indeed, indeed. But on the one hand, it creates an opening. And the fact that the means of production are so global now, right, that a single computer can be made in how many different countries, right? You can have a pen. I'm holding a pen right now. This pen itself could be made in 5-6 different countries, The working class of the world is more connected in terms of production than ever before. And that creates the opening for a new solid never seen before as well. So it's the times are fraught with new possibilities. I think we're entering the 21st century, and we're seeing a lot of what Marx wrote about in Capital about the capitalist mode of production and its problems play out. And we're also seeing a big game changer internationally because in the Soviet Union introduced in the world the industrialization of developing countries. Right? I mean, it was when Stalin was still alive, you had the Chinese Revolution. It was the Soviet Union that teamed up with Abdel Nasser, the Arab socialist president of Egypt, and electrified Egypt, built the hydroelectrical facility, the Aswan Dam, the biggest power plant in the Middle East, brought electricity to Egypt. And that a lot of the developing world has been industrialized against the wishes of Wall Street and London. And because of that, that also creates, the layer of is it possible to have an economy where Wall Street and London aren't in charge? This old, global South, global North split being kind of eradicated. And what China is doing with the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is actually very similar, oddly, to what a lot of pre-imperialist, industrial capitalist economists advocated. Henry Clay, for example. Alexander Hamilton in the United States, they basically advocated something similar to the Belt and Road because they were industrial capitalists and they had the idea, okay, well we'll help countries in South America build factories and then we can buy things from their factories and their standard of living will go up and then they'll buy things from our factories. For the industrial capitalist, what China is doing with One Belt and One Road initiative made sense. It was the rise of imperialism and the dominance of finance that kind of wiped that out. With the rise of finance capital, that didn't make any sense anymore. So it's interesting to see China's foreign policy economically is something very similar to what the United States and U.S. economists were advocating prior to the rise of imperialism.
Yeah, but it's something completely different. I mean, what they were advocating was cheaper labor out of a necessity of a falling rate of profit. They were looking for greater profits.
Sure, and but there was an understanding with Alexander Hamilton and all that in order to facilitate industrial capitalism, there was a need to invest in infrastructure, and there was a need to help develop countries so that they could more effectively purchase the products that your developing industrial economy would produce. They wanted the USA to be a center of manufacturing, And so they wanted to then have countries around the world they would cultivate as consumers of the products. And that, yeah, and that made sense. But then when you had the rise of imperialism, when all of a sudden the way the U.S. economy functions is by with banking and with control of the trade routes, all of a sudden that doesn't make any sense anymore. All of a sudden the ideas of Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton didn't really play out. If you have banking institutions that want to rule the world, you don't really need to have countries industrialize. In fact, you don't want them to industrialize. You want them to stay poor and captive,
Well,
captive
yeah,
markets.
because they need them to be. The richer countries developed so high that the poorer countries couldn't afford their products, and then what happened was with the falling rate of profit coming in, many of the first world countries couldn't even were reducing the ability to be able to afford their products because of what's the word I'm looking for? Due to the increased manufacturing costs. So it had to be manufacturing did have to start transferring to the third world countries in order to lower the cost of production and make it available. I mean, we do have seen that people do have more commodities than in previous generations, and that's largely due to the fact that they cheapened manufacturing. That has also come with the cost of destroying people's incomes. That's also come from destroying wages in the country, but it has also increased their ability to purchase as well. And the problem is that these poor countries can't buy the stuff from the first world countries unless, of course, you subsidize the hell out of it like corn.
Sure.
And then you
Yeah.
flood their market with cheap stuff and you destroy them. Well, what was it that was done to Jamaica to destroy their farmers? Because I
Yeah.
know with
No. I
Mexico
mean,
they flooded them with cheap corn, and that they did something similar to Jamaica to destroy
yeah. It
their
was
domestic
NAFTA.
crops.
It was
Yeah,
NAFTA
yeah.
basically. Yeah. And NAFTA eliminated it. They did the same thing to Haiti. They did the same thing to Mexico. I mean, it was a disaster. I mean, and yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's the same old story. And the same thing was done to Russia even in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia, they had a huge collective farm apparatus, but the collective farms would be purchased by American companies who would just close them down. And then Russia was forced to start importing its food from the United States and from Western Europe. And then after the Ukraine crisis in 2014, they put agricultural sanctions on Russia. The Obama administration did. And ironically, so then the Russian government started, using oil money to start funding the creation of their new agricultural sphere. And now Russia is actually having an agricultural boom. They're having the biggest harvest that they've ever had. And all over Siberia and the Far East, you see the rise of these new farms that are being created. With state money in Russia, they're helping people to start their own farms. It's kind of a huge breakthrough. And that actually really points toward what so much of the media analysis is missing about North Korea. Because, there's the North Korea debate, it's framed like, well, Trump is a genius negotiator, he's just going to negotiate with Kim. And, I've been to Russia. I was at the Yalta Economic Forum, and I talked to business people. I was at the World Conference of Parliamentarians last year, where there were, like, members of parliament from both North and South Korea and many different countries. And, I met with a lot of different people from around the world. The reason that Trump is doing what he's doing in North Korea is because of the fact that everybody knows pretty soon North Korea is going to give up their nuclear weapons. It's only a matter of time. And the reason that they're going to do it is because there's an economic boom going on in China and in Russia's Far East, right? In the Vladivostok, they have their big economic forums. And, Putin and President Xi, and I mean, it's like there's whole regions that are getting electrified. There's an economic boom going on in that part of the world. Asil Toji, he called it a golden era in Eurasia. And North Korea, because it has, had sanctions imposed on it by the United Nations for proliferating nuclear weapons, is like a big block, right, on what they're trying to do. And actually, there's already, there have been plans, for a long time, there's been plans to build a railway from South Korea into North Korea, into China, into Russia, all the way to Eastern Europe. And that would facilitate the production of goods in that region. But North Korea and the economic sanctions and all of that, because of that, they're kind of there. And so it's only a matter of time before North Korea gives up their nuclear weapons so they can join the economic boom taking place in this part of the world. The reason Trump is doing his thing with North Korea right now is he wants to get credit for it. He wants to be the guy who made it happen, number one. And he wants to make sure that American companies get some of North Korea, right? Because at this point, North Korea's got a huge amount of mineral resources. It's got a very well-educated population. No one ever talks about the fact that most North Koreans can speak more than one language. One of the most highly educated populations, you know. Most North Koreans can speak more than one language. You've got, you know, a huge apparatus of production. You've got, you know, a huge amount of minerals. And pretty soon, when North Korea is open for business, when, you know, they're not being blocked and locked out of the world economy, there's a fear that you know, American companies aren't going to be able to be the ones to make lots of money off of it. That's really what's going on. And Trump wants to get credit for it, number one. He wants to go down in history as the guy who made North Korea give up their nukes. And he also wants to make sure that, you know, that he and his pals and his faction in the American ruling class, they get the business deals. That's what he wants to make sure of. He wants to make sure it's not just Russian and Chinese companies that make lots of money off of North Korea when it opens up after it gives up its nukes. That's what's going on there. And you know, in other parts of the world, you'll hear this analysis, but you won't hear it in Western media, right? They just don't want to acknowledge what's going on in Eurasia right now, and in the Far East of Russia, and in China and elsewhere. They don't want to acknowledge this, but it's widely. If you look at that part of the world, right, Central Asia, the Russian Far East, there's a boom going on. There's an economic boom taking place. It's like a golden era. It's a renaissance taking place. No one wants to acknowledge that.
Hmm. That is interesting. I hadn't really considered that.
Yeah, well, the U.S. media is not talking about it a lot, but you can read about the agricultural boom in Russia. You can read about what's happening with the China-Pakistan economic corridor right now. It's the most unreported story, but this is a new reality, and again, it's not widely discussed in American media. You just get the impression that, you know, this Kim is little rocket man, he's crazy, and Trump is a negotiator, and they're completely missing the economic and geopolitical context of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula right now. And then the other thing, and I think this be said, that you know, there was an assumption in the 1970s, you know, from American media, from American think tanks, that when, you know, Deng Xiaoping came into power in China, when he made those market reforms, that was going to lead to the Chinese Communist Party being overthrown. Then they said, all right, he's going to come in there, he's going to liberalize the economy, they're going to see how great capitalism is, and the Chinese Communist Party will be overthrown. And that didn't happen. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party is stronger than it was. And the same went for Vietnam. They said this thing, oh, well, Vietnam, they're going to have their opening up moment, and pretty soon the Communist Party is going to be out. They're going to see how great capitalism is. It didn't happen, right? All over Eastern Europe, when these countries would have market reforms, Romania, Czechoslovakia, that's what would happen, right? They would start to have market reforms. The government would get in debt to Western banks, and pretty soon you'd have an overthrow, a color revolution, and they'd have a pro-American Western government that would privatize everything. That didn't happen in China. It didn't happen in Vietnam. And North Korea is different than China. It's different than Vietnam because the Korean Workers' Party is a very, very ideological party, right? I mean, this is a party that welcomed the Black Panthers as heroes during the 1970s. I mean, look at the paintings that are on display. They are a very, very ideological, revolutionary, anti-imperialist party. And there's a fear, I believe, among the American intelligence agencies and others, that if North Korea is able to have this economic boom that's pretty much inevitable when they give up their nuclear weapons, that will strengthen the Korean Workers' Party to spread its ideology all over the world. That's basically the fear. They don't want to give North Korea, you know, an economic boom because they fear that will result in North Korea's ideas and North Korea's perspective getting spread all across the planet. That's what they're afraid of. And they kind of know it's almost inevitable at this point, but they're trying to hold it off. And I think that's what the attack on the North Korean embassy in Spain by individuals that the local Spanish press is reporting, not me. The Spanish press locally was saying that the individuals that carried out those attacks on the North Korean embassy were linked to the CIA. That's what was being reported locally in Spain. They're trying to do everything they can to prevent, you know, the inevitable, which is North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons and having a huge wave of investment and having a huge economic boom. There's going to be a boom in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. It's going to happen. And the Western intelligence agencies are terrified of the political results of that.
Hmm.
You know? I,
A
I
developed DPRK is definitely something that they are afraid of. Well, I mean, obviously, if you want the destabilization and destruction of the DPRK, then yeah, anything that would help develop it would be something that would be, that
sure.
they're definitely against.
Right, but China has made clear they are not interested in spreading their ideology all over the world. They've made that very, very clear. They believe socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism works for China, but they have no interest in spreading it around the world. The Vietnamese Communist Party has made other statements to that effect. But North Korea, you listen to their rhetoric, they still believe in global communist revolution to some degree or other. That seems to be the fear, or maybe they say they don't, but there's a fear that they do, right? And the fact that they've been, that during the 1990s, when the Arduous March happened, they call it the Arduous March in North Korea, and in North Korea, millions of people starved to death because of U.S. sanctions, because they needed oil to run their agricultural system. They needed oil to run it, right? It's the mountainous part of the Korean Peninsula. There's not much arable land there, and they had achieved food self-sufficiency, but they needed oil. And when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, and you had the dominance of the petrodollar, and they couldn't import oil from anybody, people starved to death. It was a big disaster. And according to American media, that's all just because Kim Il Sung is evil and evil communism. But according to North Koreans who actually experienced this, it was because the United States had blockaded their country and prevented them from getting oil and from running their food system. It was foreign sabotage. It was efforts of the United States, and those wounds are fresh. And you have millions of people starving to death because of a foreign country. That doesn't go away. The anger and the resentment doesn't go away. And I think that the wounds from that, which was really just a continuation of the Korean War, what happened, right? Millions of people died in the Korean War. The USA bombed every building above 1 story tall on the Korean Peninsula. The bombers were coming back to the generals and saying, "Where do we bomb? There's nothing left to bomb in North Korea." I mean, it was just massive, the amount of atrocities and killing that went on during the Korean War. And then you have in the 1990s where there was, a famine imposed on North Korea in the hopes of toppling the Korean Workers' Party. The scars and wounds of U.S. inflicted death in North Korea are very, 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 fresh in the memories of the people there. It's not something that they just easily forget.
No, no, that's gonna live on for a very, very long time.
Right. And it's because of that, I think, that the American establishment is very afraid of North Korea having an economic boom, because that will make, the Korean people, it will highlight their voice around the world, and it will bring more respect for their system, and it'll raise the credibility and the prowess of, the DPRK and the Korean Workers' Party. And I think that that's the fear. I think that's what's going on. And I think, the intelligence agencies of the United States probably realize this is going to happen inevitably. And the other thing, though, is if you listen to Jim Rogers is this billionaire. He's an American billionaire, legendary investor, was actually a good friend of George Soros at one point, and now they're no longer friends. They were business partners for a while. He lives in Singapore, and he was on Fox News. He's a big supporter of Trump, and he's saying, "I want to invest in North Korea. There's millions of dollars to be made." He represents that faction that's ready to get rich off of North Korea. And I write about this in the new book. I have a whole section on the Korean reforms and the negotiations with Trump and what's really going on there. But again, this is U.S. media will never highlight this perspective, right? They'll never highlight the reality of what's taking place on the Korean Peninsula and in that region overall. It's a game changer. We're living in a new world. Parts of the world that used to be deeply, deeply impoverished are becoming very, very rapidly industrialized. And then the imperialist centers, especially the United States, are deindustrializing and undeveloping. I mean, they're unpaving the roads all across the United States right now, right? They have this device called a reclaimer, it's called. It's a big machine. It rips up the asphalt, pulverizes it, and paves it and lays it out back on the road. And where you used to have a paved road, you have a dirt road. There are big chunks of this country right now where water is not being properly purified, right? I mean, the Flint water crisis was the very extreme one with lead in the water and all that, but it's all across the country that we're having a problem with how our water is being purified. Our power plants are defective. I mean, I'm sitting right now in Manhattan, right? Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, that's Wall Street, that's the capital of capitalism, right? This is supposed to be, the center of the global capitalist system, the richest city in the world, right? Like a couple weekends ago, like a big chunk of this island from 42nd Street, where Times Square is, up into 50th Street, and didn't have electricity. And the trains stopped running, and they had to evacuate people from the subway trains that were underground. Four power station, one power station, substation lit on fire. Four other ones went out. This is the capital of capitalism. That's how vulnerable our infrastructure is, right? During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, a power plant on the Lower East Side of New York City blew up and exploded because of the Hurricane Sandy. You can watch footage of it. It's amazing. Watch a power plant in Manhattan explode. This is unbelievable. The capitalist system at this point is so tied to finance, and it's so separate from any effort to industrialize that it's deindustrializing the imperialist centers. Look at Detroit. Look at Cleveland, where I lived for a few years. Look at Pittsburgh, right? All of these former industrial centers of the United States are in utter decay. And then what are the capitalists doing? Are they trying to fix this? No, they're figuring out ways to make money off of it. Oh, okay, all these people are depressed and all of that. Let's push doctors to overprescribe opioid medications, so we can get them all hooked and make money, right? Big Pharma has made a huge amount of profits off of that, right? Oh, well, people are not having economic opportunity like they once did. Maybe they're turning to crime more. Let's have a prison industrial complex. Let's privatize the prisons. Okay, when they all go to jail, we can make money off of that. It's like that's where we're at. There's no central vision. There's no overall, overall vision. The capitalists are all just scrambling to make lots of money, and the society is running in 12, 25 different ways. Trump's election was very much a result of that, of just U.S. society is coming apart because it's committed to this free market individualism, this idea that, hey, it's all about making a profit. At this point, U.S. society, what does it even mean to be an American at this point? I'm born in Ohio, from the United States. What is the American identity at this point? There isn't one, right? It's utterly amazing. The West that rose to power with the rise, with industrial capitalism, the British textile mills, American manufacturing. At this point, capitalism is destroying the Western imperialist centers. Meanwhile, we're seeing started as a result of the Soviet Union, the rise of countries around, Eurasia and the global South. What started as a result of Lenin and Stalin and Mao is leading countries in the developing world to become stronger and more economically prosperous than ever before. This is a big reversal. The 21st century is an era of great reversal.
It definitely very much is. And this is straight up capitalism. Yeah. There is nothing left to bleed out of, because the manufacturing does have to be sent elsewhere in order for it to remain profitable. That's leaving a huge gap of what's available here. And of course, the U.S. is suffering this, a great deal more than Canada is. But essentially, yes, they have had to resort to alternative markets, such as the prison industrial complex, overprescribing medication for... it's a twofold thing there. One, it keeps people relatively placid if they're just high all the time, but on the other end, and it also makes money at the same time. But again, such people aren't productive. If you're high all the time, you're not going to be very productive. But then they don't have anything for you to do anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the era that we're living in, and the capitalists have figured out how they can insulate themselves from the results of their decisions, where they can keep making profits despite the fact that people don't have spending power, that people don't have good-paying jobs, the fact that the standard of living is decreasing on Main Street. Wall Street has figured out a million ways, a million little rip-off schemes to keep making profits, so they don't suffer as a result of their decisions, and that's the big problem. And we're entering this crisis of Western capitalism, and really, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but really the only way out is to have the banks, factories, and industries operated according to a central plan. We need socialism more than ever. Socialism is really the only way out of this mess, right? That if we continue to have a global capitalist system centered around capitalists making profits, the things are only going to get worse. And I think the necessity of socialism is now more apparent than it's ever been.
Well, that's definitely true.
Yeah. No, and that raises questions though about what socialism will look. I know you and I have perspectives on that, and I think that's okay. And I think that ultimately, what comes into being is not going to be like what exists now and in different parts of the world. It's not going to be like what existed during the 20th century. It's not going to be like the Paris Commune of 1871. I think socialism evolves and adjusts and asserts itself differently in different countries and different times and different situations. I don't know what the socialism that will eventually come to the United States will look like, and it won't be up to me ultimately. It'll be up to the society in general. But different models, different forms of socialism will emerge. I think what the Bolivarians are doing is very different than what the Soviet Union did. I
Oh
think
well,
what
yeah.
what what Mao did in China was very different than what Stalin did. And as much as Mao did admire Stalin to some degree, what he did, with building the peasant communes and the theory of new democracy was very different than what Stalin did. And what Lenin did in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution was completely different than what the Paris Commune was in 1871. And the world is constantly changing, right? That A never equals A, right? That's the point. Is that the first A that you draw can never be the same as the second one, right? The present is never the same as the future. It's never the same as the past. That the world is constantly in flux and in motion. That's the basic of dialectical materialism, the foundation of Marxist thought.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree.
Yeah, yeah. It's always fun with you, Jason. Anything else on your mind? Probably should get going here in a little bit, but I'm chatting. How are your viewers doing? Are they enjoying our chat?
Yeah, they seem to be enjoying it well enough.
Okay, good. Well, I encourage them to get a copy of my new book because my new book certainly has a new take on socialism. If you look at the cover, people said to me they thought my book was a sci-fi novel. When they looked at the cover, they saw that futurist cityscape with like an old arch from ancient Greece, and they're like, "What's going on there?" And it's certainly not like anything you're going to see. It's not like a Bernie Krat, kind of book. It's not some kind of dogmatic thing you'd get from some old, ML group in the United States. It's certainly a new approach that I have. And everyone who reads it says that they're quite surprised. It's not like other things I've done. But if you like other things I've done, like Getting Rich Without Capitalism and books like that, you'll like this for sure. But it's a new kind of thing. I did kind of I experimented quite a bit with my style of rhetoric and such in the book. And I think your viewers will get a kick out of it.
Yeah, I'll definitely. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna plug it when it comes out.
Sure. Well, it's already out. Yeah, yeah. It's
Oh, it is out.
available. Oh yeah, yeah. You can
Oh,
get it on Lulu.com. You can get it on Amazon.com. You can go to your local bookstore and order it. Yeah,
uh,
it's widely available. And it's
do you
selling
do
too.
you do you have an Amazon link? I'll send it out right now.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go to Amazon.com, type in my name, it'll come right up. City builders and vandals in our age, and yeah, and I've been going around and promoting it in different media outlets. It's quite popular. I'm getting a lot of good feedback on it from different people. People say that they're quite surprised by it. So yeah,
Uh,
I'm glad I did it. I try to do a book or so every year. Try to kind of do different themes. So yeah, people like it. People really do. I'm getting positive feedback on it at least. I probably sound like Trump now, right? It's amazing. It's just like totally awesome. You got to get a copy today. I don't
it's
want
the
to sound like
best
Trump.
book.
So.
That's the best book that's ever written. If you disagree, you hate America.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. No, you got to get to Canada these days. No. I those who've gone to Canada tell me it's really amazing. You're saying it's really there.
Well, I
Uh,
mean,
uh,
we're really beginning to have our problems.
mhm,
We're really running into the we're heading down the U.S. path, kind of thing.
mhm.
For example, people come here, Niagara Falls, where I am, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's so beautiful. It's so great." And I'm like, "Yeah, maybe you should step outside the tourist area because it ain't so great there."
Wow.
Because
Yeah.
I know because I used to work in the hospital system for the
Mm,
Niagara region, so I know I know what's going on. I know that uh, we have an insanely high drug rate, and I'm not even talking about marijuana, which is legal. I'm talking about drugs that are illegal. We do have to a degree a meth problem,
Wow.
an STD problem. We have one of the highest suicide rates. Like this, like it's we're starting down the path that America has already gone down, but we're just starting it, and
Yeah.
we are definitely headed in that direction, and that's gonna be a problem because largely we've always been able to get away with being able to say, okay, yeah, we're the Western democracy, but we're not like America, and that's always been, a load of BS to a large degree. While we had this big moral opposition to the Vietnam War, plenty of Canadian factories were making, tons of money off of manufacturing for the U.S. Army. So we were largely huge hypocrites in that regard. And the fact is, we are being slowly dragged in that direction. But I am glad that while we did have our Donald Trump get elected in Ontario, that being Doug Ford,
Yeah.
the tide is turning against him. The population is like turning against him, and I was like, what did you think was going to happen? He espoused free market fundamentalist BS. He said, let's defund education. Let's take all the areas of the protected biosphere. Like there's a very large protected area in Niagara for the environment, and that has largely to do with environmental issues. Also, it protects the wine growing region because within Niagara there's a very, very large wine growing region, and that can be very, very sensitive because there is manufacturing not too far away and close to the shipping lanes and all that. And he said, well, let's just sell that off. Let's just get rid of all the wind turbines and get rid of all of that. And as he's starting to do it, people are outraged and it's like, what did you think was going to happen? You said he was going to do this. And then he wanted to eliminate sex education in schools. I'm like, no, that's like one of the things we do right.
Well, tell me, there's a famous Canadian I've heard about, Tommy Douglas.
Yes.
What do you make of him?
He was basically the. There seems to be some debate on whether or not he was a communist at one point. I maintain that he probably was, and at a point in the 40s, the Communist Party was outlawed. Essentially, what happened was somebody from the Communist Party of Canada got elected to Parliament. It was
Yeah.
a guy by the name of Fred Rose, who was a Polish immigrant. So as soon as he got elected, oh, you're a Stalin spy. We have to deport you now.
Wow.
Yeah, okay. Like, like they kind of said, like you can't vote in communism, and this is kind of why. So when it became outlawed, he founded a party called the New Democratic Party with a lot of like-minded people, and their primary platform was universal health care. Because they noticed that in Saskatchewan, where this happened, it's Saskatchewan, to a degree, it still is a very rural area. And if a farmer got sick or he got injured, to a serious enough degree, he was done for. He was gonna be bankrupt. His farm was gonna go under, etc. And so basically, he ran on the platform of universal healthcare for everybody. And that's essentially how he won. And that was the idea that spread on from there. So he is credited with the creation of universal health care in Canada.
Wow. Well, I always just, he had this story he would tell called Cats in Mouse Land. Have you ever heard that?
It sounds familiar, but I don't recall it.
Well, apparently he was famous for this story he would tell. And he would say, once upon a time, there was a land that was all mice. It was just all mice. And they would be eaten by cats, right?
Yeah.
But then every year, they got to vote on which cat would be the head of the country, of Mouseland, right?
Yeah.
And some years they would vote for a white cat to be the head of Mouseland, and some years they would vote for a black cat to be head of Mouseland. And some of the cats would say, well, they wanted the holes that the mice would hide in to be round. And some of the cats would say, well, we want the holes the mice hide in to be made square. But it was always just a question of which cat do you want to vote for? And then one day, one mouse had the idea that maybe we shouldn't have a government of cats. Maybe since it's Mouseland, it should be a government of mice. I like that. I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was a good anecdote.
I was just,
kind of.
Sorry, I was just double checking this. In 2004, we had a Greatest Canadian contest where the public voted to see who would be the greatest, who's the greatest Canadian of history, and yeah, Tommy Douglas came out as number one.
Wow. Well, and he was like a social democrat, right? I mean, he wasn't a revolutionary, but he was like a social democrat.
Yeah, he was
right?
like the Communist Party was outlawed, so he formed an alternative. Although interestingly, once you get down to number 26, it was Dr. Norman Bethune, who was a straight up communist. He served in the Spanish Civil War, and he was in Mao's Red Army.
Yeah.
As a surgeon under the name Bachun.
No, I mean, Norman Bethune is, I mean, in China, he's widely loved. I mean, he's like the speech at Norman Bethune's funeral from Mao is one of his most quoted essays.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
If you go to his home, which, Norman Bethune's home, which is like a museum of sorts here, it's flooded with Chinese tourists all the time.
Yeah, no, Norman Bethune was a doctor. He was a wealthy doctor in Canada. And he was, my understanding of how he became a communist was he was just walking down the street one day, and he saw the police beat a group of communist protesters that were protesting, demanding jobs. And so he ran to help people that were being beaten up, and the police arrested him and put him in jail, too, along with the people. And that's how he got introduced to the Communist Party of Canada. And he eventually went to Spain, and then he eventually died in China. Yeah,
I think he's largely credited with the discovery of blood types as well.
Really? I didn't know that.
And
wow.
He invented the mobile blood clinic.
Wow.
Well, I mean, like the carrying blood to soldiers who had been injured, not like a blood clinic.
But yeah, I mean, and it shows how sometimes, because of circumstances, I mean, who'd have thought that this wealthy doctor, in Canada would just be walking down the street one day, and next thing you know, he's a communist, and pretty soon he's dying in China, and he's one of Mao's, Mao is giving a big speech at his funeral. It's so, who'd have thought, people change, They have a big moment where they're in the middle of their life, they're living it one way, and all of a sudden something happens that makes them do a big double take, and they start down a completely different road, right?
Yeah, I remember watching that when that series came out, and they said that when they described Norman Bethune, the announcer or the host of the show said after the clip on Norman Bethune said the fact that he was a communist has been forgiven. What?
Wow.
What? No, fuck you, man.
Yeah. Well, that's what he was about. I mean, that was. I mean, it wasn't just a minor detail.
That's kind of the cornerstone of why he did everything that he did.
It's kind of like saying, the fact that the Pope was a Catholic, we forgive him. All right, well, Jason, it's always fun to talk to you. It's always great. So I gotta run at the moment, but I'm glad we were able to check in and have a good chat, and it's been fun. Sound good? All good?
Definitely.
All right. Okay, we'll talk to you soon. Okay.
All right.
Bye for now. Yep.